Welcome everyone to the 2022 NAWCC Times Symposium. These annual events are the flagship, and James used that word earlier, so we're two flagships tonight. Flagship of the NAWCC's education mission. I've had the pleasure of organizing these conferences since 2016, when I created the Clocks at Winter Symposium. This was followed by Horology in Art in 2017 at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Then Cars, Clocks, and Watches in 2018 at the Henry Ford Museum. And as you see, Henry Ford was also one of our great collectors. And then Horology 1776, last year in Philadelphia, where you see our special guest and banquet speaker, and also Mary Jane Dapkus is here, who also appears in this picture with Ben Franklin, and she can tell you about how exciting it was for her to meet Ben Franklin, because she thought he had died long ago. It was a great thrill for her. So as you may guess, these events take years to develop. I discovered that I first began preparations for today's event in 2018, 4 years ago. Such intensive planning also includes my 4 trips to Germany for the 2019 Symposium in Nuremberg, which was international, when we partnered with our sister Horological Society in Europe. And if the guy on the left looks familiar, that's James Nye, who again somehow got on the stage right in a panel discussion. So you're on a roll here, right, James? And my deep thanks to my friends here today, who also enjoyed that German adventure and other historic conferences with us. And of course, I'm also extremely grateful to Sotheby's, not only for the exclusive sponsorship, but also for wisely employing for so many years the speaker we're about to hear in just a few minutes. Since 1984, when the James Arthur Collection came to the NAWCC, the lecture named in his honor has been a keystone of what initially were called our yearly educational seminars. This has taken place in cities all across America for more than 40 years. Today marks the 57th James Arthur lecture since they began in 1932, 90 years ago right here in New York City. Come back to New York City. As a key part of his generous 1926 bequest to New York University of his clocks, watches, books, and endowment funds now worth the equivalent of $1.5 million, Mr. Arthur's will mandated an ongoing series of lectures entitled Time and Its Mysteries. You see the title page of one of the 3 small books of these lectures that were published by NYU in 1936, 1940, and 1949. You also see here the names of 4 eminent James Arthur lecturers, including the renowned American educator, John Dewey. His famous quote still rings true, and I hope this is why we're all here today, getting educated. This is an early photograph of James Arthur and his adorable grandchild. He was born in 1842, lived in Ireland and Scotland until age 29 when he moved to America. By 1908, he'd amassed a sizable and valuable horological collection, nearly 200 clocks and more than 1,100 watches. And this was an early catalog that he did of his collection then, and he died in 1930. In 1932, this book was produced by another James Arthur lecturer and the first curator of the collection, D.W. Herring. It was a thorough description of the collection. You see him here with an early lantern clock that was in the collection. Some of James Arthur's clocks are visible in this photo. They were crowded into a university basement quarters that were never suitable or large enough to exhibit and care for the collection as the donor had expected. In this Herring book illustration, the clock shown on the right is now ticking upstairs in the HSNY library. I was able to purchase this clock 4 years ago. It stood in my Massachusetts home until I recently donated it to the Horological Society of New York, and you see it through their door. This brings the clock back to the city where James Arthur had wanted his clocks always to be on display. Another early curator of the NYU collection was Brooks Palmer, well known for his books, his scholarship, and his activity during the NAWCC's early years. You see that in 1951, when he was NAWCC president, he was the James Arthur lecturer. A 1961 letter from him expressed appreciation as curator for the gift of a clock to the Arthur collection. And if you look closely, you'll see the kind of clock it is, because he's referring to the 19th century Jerome and Company flying ball clocks, which were later reproduced by Charlie Terwilliger. And you see 5 of those repros being sold in one lot at a 2018 New Hampshire auction. Yet another curator of the NYU Arthur collection was Dr. Arthur Lionel Rawlings. He was featured in this early Giants column in the April 1985 issue of the NAWCC magazine, and the 3rd edition of his classic book has a glowing preface written by George Daniels. I came across the Brooks Palmer letter and much more during my 2009 visit to the Smithsonian Archives in Suitland, Maryland, where I explored boxes of James Arthur papers. Also in those old file folders was a sad reminder of Arthur's unmet vision for the permanent exhibition of his bequests. This 1930s architectural rendering of a temple of time is as far as the grand idea ever went, but maybe not dead yet. Weagle. In addition to his papers, the Smithsonian, Washington, D.C. retains a substantial portion of the Arthur collection. My detective work was needed to determine this, since none of the object descriptions at the Smithsonian show Arthur's name or even NYU provenance. I created a list, again, sorry it's a little small, from relevant series of accession numbers, and I was able to identify 210 of his Arthur clocks and watches still at the Smithsonian. I've highlighted a few of the important pieces still there in dark storage. Again, sorry for the small size. You see 2 early marine chronometers by Arnold and Earnshaw, a very rare cosmochronotrope, which was an important thing that they exhibited for some years, and that was something from the Arthur collection, as was this Jouvet globe clock as well. Some of these may well have been acquired after the death of James Arthur, when many fine clocks and watches were added to the collection. There's also some James Arthur clocks on the NYU campus downtown from here. I photographed this one through a window, and you see me taking the picture in the window, in case you don't believe me. His standing clocks were distributed long ago to various university locations, and apparently were never recovered when the collection was broken up. I viewed a few of these as I made the rounds of campus offices with my clockmaker friend, John Metcalf, who's here, and I thank you for touring me around the NYU campus that day, because he had serviced some of those James Arthur clocks on the campus, and he, I'm sure, over dinner can tell you a lot about those clocks as well, since he explored inside them. My research on James Arthur was hugely expanded by my wife, Jane Shinto, who's here in the back. You see her here with another Arthur collection clock that never made it away from NYU. It's a very rare 18th century William Claggett of Newport, Rhode Island. Note its unique lunar indicator. In 2018, we saw it standing backstage in their archive storage, and it was soon to be crated and locked up somewhere, we don't know where. Jane's highly detailed 4-part series was published in Main Antique Digest in 2018 and 2019, reprints of the series. I hope, I see the pile's gone, so I'm assuming many of you have taken the reprints we did of her article about that. And they also can be read as PDFs and links on the Arthur page of the Symposium website. A crucial discovery we made when we were just starting this research was that the great-granddaughter of James Arthur still lives in Florida. We visited her in 2018. She gladly showed us more Arthur clocks, watches, and family photographs, which she generously allowed Jean to include in the articles. We're very sorry, however, that her mother had died about 4 years earlier and had not lived long enough for our visit and for Jean's reporting. Her mother had struggled unsuccessfully for decades to revive interest in her grandfather's collection and in his dying wishes. We saw letters she wrote to the Smithsonian and NYU, where's the stuff? You know, nobody replied. It was heartbreaking, and again, we were sorry that we couldn't have demonstrated to her mother in time that there still was interest. In both of these women's photos, you see them standing with clocks designed and made by James Arthur himself, as was the one I photographed through the NYU window. He was a highly skilled machinist. He experimented with materials and concepts that today make his clocks immediately recognizable. including this banjo clock and this unique movement. Others are standing at the NAWCC Museum. Back in the early 1960s, NYU's leadership decided that the collection had no home there, so everything was shipped to the Smithsonian on loan. By the 80s, however, the Smithsonian wanted to send it back, unless it was gifted. So NYU attempted to sell the entire collection instead. However, an alert NAWCC member and lawyer saw the tiny legal announcement in the newspaper, halted the sale, and arranged for much of the collection to come to the NAWCC Museum. Again, I apologize for the small size, but we see in this 1983 court-ordered Memo of Understanding, which Bob Levy could probably parse for us too, our attorney friend here from the island. This was what divided up the collection. Some choice pieces, however, were sold to Seth Atwood for his Time Museum in Rockford, Illinois. The NAWCC proudly announced the arrival of the collection and continues to display many of its clocks and watches. Here you see a fine quarter repeating Breguet watch in its own showcase at the NAWCC Museum. Recently, a bit more of the Arthur collection has returned to New York, but only temporarily on loan from the NAWCC. Upstairs in the HSNY library is a small exhibit of Arthur watches, which I encourage you to visit sometime over these next couple of days. Two rare watches that were made by the Freeport Watch Company were among the 1983 purchases by Seth Atwood. These watches later reappeared when the Time Museum contents were auctioned in blockbuster sales that Daryn will probably talk about some 20 years ago. Here's the catalog listing from one of those Sotheby's catalogs, listing for the first of those Freeport watches, indicating the Arthur provenance. And much as I hate to say this, Daryn, we also see how the sales estimates often did not come anywhere near the hammer prices. Note the high estimate of $2,000 and the $40,000 winning bid that I recorded. I'm sure you'll be able to tell us of it. Yeah, good. So seeing those stunning catalogs points to the importance of all the printed auction catalogs upstairs in the HSNY library. These include the single collector ones that I gathered together into an exhibit designed to reinforce the great collector theme of this symposium, and they're also in your program, your printed program. As you see from this quote in a recent article of England's Country Life magazine, many of us are lamenting the abandonment of printed catalogs that, in our opinion, cannot really be replaced by online versions. So, as I introduce this year's James Arthur Lecturer, I can say that she is just the second woman in 90 years to have this honor. The first was my selection for last year's symposium in Philadelphia. Dr. Sarah Schechner oversees Harvard University's scientific instrument collection. And as I showed this title image from a lecture of mine back in 2013, I'm pleased to say today that his legacy is not so almost forgotten. We're doing our part to honor him and the hundreds of other horological collectors who we never should forget. Our 2022 James Arthur Lecturer joined Sotheby's in 1980, fresh out of second grade, right? And she now chairs the venerable firm's International Watch Division. I should add that she and I are liverymen of London's Worshipful Company of Clockmakers, and our boss, this year's master, Dr. James Nye, who you see here in his regalia, also is here in the front row. Daryn will speak about her experiences with great collectors and great collections, and how vital they are to us today. Daryn Schnipper.
Thank you, Bob. That was just an amazing introduction, and I'm honored to be here as the James Arthur Lecturer. And I can't believe I'm only the second woman, but hey, in 90 years more, there might be 2 more. So, good evening. It's wonderful to be here tonight and to speak to you about some of the collectors that I have known and worked with. When Bob asked if I would do this lecture, I jumped at the opportunity because I could share decades worth of interactions with great collectors. But of course, we don't have enough time. After more than 4 decades, I've worked with a multitude, and for sure, they all come in different shapes and sizes from different walks of life, be it royalty or captains of industry. They are fueled by various motivations and goals for their collections. Some find the thrill of the chase, others the idea of possession, while there are those who are interested from a scholarly standpoint. Yet another type is relentless in their quest for the missing piece that will be the crowning achievement of their collection. My journey into the horological universe began during a college summer internship in 1978. My internship was spent researching the auction of King Farouk, who we show over here on the bottom right. Why was I doing it, you say? Well, I had been employed by the well-known collector, watch dealer, Abe Sotheby. Some of you may remember him. And he set me on my horological path from that summer. Abe was writing a book about the King's watch collection and the auction that followed Farouk's ouster by a military coup in 1952. Abe, a fascinating character, could be found searching for watches all over the world, in the markets of Istanbul, meeting Maharajas in India, or venturing into China to negotiate with cultural committees. Following a trip to India, he proudly told me that he was introduced to a Maharaja, and proceeded to show me an Automata watch that he had bought. Abe was amongst the first wave of Westerners in the 1970s allowed to travel to and within China. He brought back majestic watches made for the Chinese market. But I digress. I acquainted myself, back to King Farouk, with the catalog, the collection of his catalog. I flipped through the catalog of black and white pictures that exposed me to a world I had no idea existed. I was next sent to Sotheby's, where I met Kevin Tierney, then Sotheby's head of silver, watches, and virtue, my first boss, and has been a lifelong friend and principal mentor. At Sotheby's, I poured through the watch catalog library. To find examples that had reemerged auction years later. Another highlight was our visit to a Fifth Avenue collector who, although he is no longer with us, his family is, and I can't mention his name. So you'll be hearing a little bit about him. Our Fifth Avenue collector traveled to Cairo and purchased several spectacular pieces at the auction. And when we went to his apartment to look at the objects, it brought to life what I'd seen in black and white photographs. Little did I know that more than 3 decades later, I would be offering these pieces on the behalf of his heirs at auction. Let's say, from that point on, I was hooked on watches, and as all of my horological friends would say, bitten by the horology bug. So, the auction. The auction was basically an extravaganza, the likes of which I'm still not sure we've seen again. It had many thousands of lots in sale. Farouk had been ousted from Egypt in 1952 in a military coup, and he was not allowed to take anything with him with the exception of maybe a few bottles. In short order, Sotheby's was selected, the sale title, the Palace Collections of Egypt was chosen, the auction dates of Cairo, February to March 1954, selected. The pieces were cataloged, photographed by Sotheby's experts. So showing there, you've got one of the covers, and I believe it's the cover of the catalog of the watches, and there are some watches, those are not the most extravagant ones. But on the right is the famous Fabergé Swan Easter egg, which was bought by Maurice Sandoz, who I'll come to a little later, and still in that collection. King Farouk was known for his oversized habits, which were no exception when it came to collecting. The auction included thousands of items, and as I said, ran from mid-February. I'm talking about the auctions themselves, not like the lead up to. From mid-February until the end of March. The auctions were touted as the most important ones since Versailles in 1793, and arguably the blockbuster auction of any time. The collection encompassed jewelry, coins and medals, Fabergé, silver, stamps, gallet, glass, and paperweights, to name some. In the following years, the Farouk pieces attained a fame unto themselves, the provenance often significantly adding to the ultimate price of the piece. As you can imagine in the auction world, we get really excited when an object comes to us with that provenance. So, where are they now? Which was why I was sent to Sotheby's so long ago. I never left. Gustave Loup, shown right here, actually came from a Swiss watchmaking family that had relocated to China, and Gustave was born in China. Gustave really can be credited with all of our knowledge based on Chinese market watches, because he collaborated with Alfred Chapuis to write the book Le Montre Chinois in 1919, and the majority of his watches are included in that collection. In fact, I was very excited to see today the Majesty of the Chinese Watch, which is in fact a detailed account of Loup's life. When Loup moved back to Geneva, which he, according to information, he would go back and forth, and you can imagine the end of the 19th century, that wasn't so easy, but he did it nonetheless and brought his watches with him for his final trip in 1920 when he permanently moved. Pieces from his collection form the foundation of many important collections today. So one of the watches that was in his collection that he sold to King Farouk, or his agents, is right below him. It's a sun flask, really quite beautiful, but what happens, you open little compartments and you find a timepiece, an automaton, and also doubles as a scent bomb. And that came from his Gustave Loup and went to King Farouk. The next piece, at the top, is the Magician's Box. They thought so highly of that in the catalog. I think it's the only four-color picture in this black and white catalog from 1954. The Magician's Box is just a masterful example of the Geneva Fabrique doing its best work. The box contains a number of questions printed on tablets. The tablets are inserted into the box. The magician waves his wand, and a branch in the tree to his left opens to reveal the answer. A couple of questions. La chose incomprehensible, la vie, or the thing most difficult to understand life. Another, la chose rare, un ami, the thing that's really rare, a friend. The gold and enamel musical box on the bottom was also in the Farouk sale. And this one displays the scene of a fortune teller, but when you open the box, you get a lovely surprise, which is a scene of an automata with two figures playing a harp and a lute to two tunes of music. And at the same time, upper left, sadly I don't have a picture of that today, you would find the timepiece. And as characteristic of watches for the Chinese market, that timepiece has a center seconds hand. You may be surprised to know that all three were bought in Cairo by our Fifth Avenue collector, who had personally attended the sale. In fact, I believe he attended the sale with Mr. Schaefer of Olivier Rousset, who was his advisor. Which brings me to my next thought, which is the famous or legendary exhibition in New York, just down the street at Olivier Rousset, called Antique Automatons. There's a little bit of the part of the catalog there showing Olivier Rousset when they were at near the Apple store. I can't believe that's the location I give as a landmark. But maybe it's fitting. They've now moved, but they're still on Fifth Avenue. In the center, we've got Maurice Sandoz. Well, Maurice Sandoz was really important because he actually lent the lion's share of his collection to the exhibition. He was loath to do so, but apparently he was quite involved in the Pestalozzi Foundation of America, which helped children in need. And thus, he agreed to lend probably 50 pieces to the collection that came from the Louvre in Switzerland. Well, on the right side, you see this very early, wonderful Jacques Edreau singing bird scent bottle, which had belonged to Sandoz, was sold to him by Olivier Rousset in 1942 for the price of $2,997. In 2015, we sold it for $2.1 million, and now it has a new home in the Paddock Museum and can be enjoyed there. Now we move to the man everybody's been waiting to hear about. So, my first business trip, and now I'm living, and I don't know if Will recall this, I was sent to Rockford to go look at the museum. Oh, you're going to Chicago, you must go to the Rockford, the Time Museum. And Will was really wonderful, charming as always, took me around, and it was really great fun. And that was the first of many, many times that I went there. You're showing here the Time Museum entrance as it was in 1999 when it closed. And then also the Clock Tower Inn where the museum was housed. And that was always the interesting part. In the middle of cornfields, which no longer probably exist, I think it's all shopping malls. But in the middle of the cornfields, you had what was really referred to as the great mecca of Western horology. And it lasted almost 31 years. Well, in the 1960s, Seth began his collection, and he emerged as a powerful force. His goal was to collect roughly 100 pieces that would tell the story of time. In 1968, he appeared in London with a laundry list of pieces he wanted for his collection. During that visit, he purchased his first piece, a tourbillon minute repeater at Sotheby's, London, where he met Tina Miller, my opposite number in those days, in London, and George Daniels. I was lucky enough to also count both them as colleagues and mentors. In a preface to Sotheby's 1986 catalog, which was the first teak session from the Time Museum, George Daniels wrote, "Not for him, the supplicant waiting for the summons to appear when it was thought he was a qualified purchaser. His method was to approach every known and established horologist, whatever their specialty, and the pieces he wanted to build a complete picture of the development of the timekeeper. Never in the history of watch collecting had so great a surprise confronted so many horologists. Nothing but the best would do, everything contributory, especially unique and extremely rare pieces were sought." The reaction to this simple approach to the assembly of a collection of such magnitude was met with quite a lot of astonishment. At that point, horology was even then becoming a well sought after collecting area, and no one thought that he could acquire the pieces to build his collection because after all, at this point they'd all been bought. Daniels continued to write that although Atwood thought 100 pieces could reach his goal to tell the story of time, it grew eventually into 4,000 pieces. What Atwood could not obtain, he commissioned a replica, such as, let's see, yes, a replica. So in the upper right, you see what looks to be H1, but in fact, it's a magnificent, amazing copy by someone called Len Salzer, who, when asked why he made the copy, which he did all the measurements through a glass in the Maritime Museum, or the Royal Observatory, sorry, he just said he thought it was a good thing to do. So the first copy is actually now at Greenwich, and once Seth got wind of it, he commissioned Len Salzer to make him one. And that we had for many months on our 8th floor near a board room, in motion, just, ticking away. It was a wonderful thing. Showing here, the coup de grace, the Henry Graves super complication, the Mudge Green, one of 2 such chronometers that Mudge made, or 3 I think, but the case is lost on the 3rd one, and Margette's number 1. So the museum was born, and in order to house Atwood's growing collection, he had to move out of his home and into the ground floor of the hotel called the Clock Tower Inn, which he owned, conveniently. Eventually, he added another wing to the hotel, possibly to enlarge the footprint of his ever-growing collection. Atwood not only achieved his goal of 4,000, of telling the story of time in such magnificent magnitude, that he had commissioned books to be written on every aspect of the collection. And as a result, horologists, collectors, curators, dealers around the world flocked to make the pilgrimage to Rockford, to the Time Museum in the middle of the cornfields. Sadly, the Time Museum closed 30 years later, March 12th at 12 noon, 1999. That was the message that I received from Patricia Atwood. The announcement unleashed battle royale to win the collection. Sotheby's would come out on top and sold the collection in 4 single-owner sales between 1999 and 2004. Some of the highlights were not pictured here, though, was Duke d'Orléans Breguet Sympathique with its original watch, although restored by George Daniels, which we played up the second time we sold it, because then he had passed away, so it was much more interesting. And of course, one of 3 James Harrison's long case clocks, and which was made prior to the epic challenge to win the Longitude Prize. So now, with all these wonderful things, and he's just starting out, mind you, in 1968, he decides he really needs to get that Henry Graves Jr. super complication. However, how would he go about this? Well, I had the great honor of hearing that story several times at the coffee shop, at the Clock Tower Inn, as told to Seth, who chain smoked incessantly in those days. I'd like to see that happen today. And how I not only heard the story, though, from Seth Atwood, but I would also hear the story from the seller, Pete Fullerton, the grandson of Henry Graves Jr., who sold the watch to Mr. Atwood in 1969. I had the great honor to know Pete Fullerton, who inherited the bulk of his grandfather's watch collection. I lunched with Pete many times over the years and heard him tell the tale of how the watch came to be sold. Negotiations lasted for much of 1969 and included several martini lunches in New York between the two. And this is corroborated on both ends. How did Atwood find Henry Graves Jr.? He simply wrote to Paddock Philippe in New York and asked, do they know who owns it? And if so, could they put the two together? Pete, at this point, had a very long association, as you can imagine, with Paddock Philippe, going back to when his grandfather was alive. Pete toyed with the idea of selling the watch in 1968 because someone from California, probably Sam Bloomfield, and toyed with the idea to sell it, but I think the offer wasn't good enough. And in a letter that year, he said to Paddock that he would only sell if he got an interesting offer. At the time, Paddock had appraised the watch for $100,000. And I think that was kind of what he was hoping to get. In January of 1969, Paddock wrote to Fullerton to let him know that there was someone who was very interested in the watch. Paddock didn't think Fullerton would sell such an important watch and didn't think he'd get the price that he wanted, so they didn't take the ask too seriously. However, Atwood, being a very tenacious fellow, sent a second letter in February. This time, Fullerton's curiosity was piqued, and he was interested in hearing a little bit more about this person that wanted to buy the Graves. Little did Paddock know the lost opportunity until 30 years later, when they failed to be the winning bidder at its 1999 auction. Anyway, back to 1969, by November, the deal was done. The day in 1999, we were set to announce the Time Museum sale, including the graves, and I had the unenviable task to inform Pete Fullerton that, in fact, the watch is coming up for sale with an estimate of $3 to $5 million, many times what he had sold it for. Pete was philosophical. My announcement was met with silence, and then he said, "I still don't regret selling the watch." In earlier conversations, read the graves of Fullerton explained he was newly married and would soon start a family. He had other priorities than keeping the turnip, his grandfather's nickname for the watch, and one that Fullerton had finally adapted. Although the super complication was gone, Fullerton kept a core collection of his grandfather's watches. Oh, wait, sorry. I'm not really good with PowerPoint. I'm sort of stuck in the 18th century. Okay, so just showing up here, we've got the famous Henry Graves arms, and that's on the original case that went to the super complication. And if you wonder why we call it the super complication, well, we weren't really very original. We decided to use the extract, the certificate, and if you probably can't read, but it says super complicated. In the middle is Henry Graves. This is his apartment, house, building by Candela, a very, very famous architect in New York, and happens to be located across the street from the Central Park Zoo. And that was the nighttime sky that the sky chart of this watch was based on. And up in our right corner is Pete Fullerton. Here we show some details of the watch. After Seth bought the watch, he had Ellen Banbury pick it up in Rockford so that it could be serviced. While it was there, they took a lot of these photographs of the underdial and showing his sidereal time and lead time. And there are several tiers to this watch, but obviously I wasn't going to show all. At the bottom, you see the two dials with the Celestial, which of course went on to inspire the modern production watches, along with the caliber 89. And then up there, we have made for Henry Graves Jr. in New York, 1932, which was, in fact, the date of delivery. Interestingly, the watch appeared in a Life magazine issue, and as well in History and Technology, the Swiss watch by Chapuis, and in both copies they blocked out, they redacted the name, shall we say. Some more, these are better close-ups, that you're seeing the dials for the clock watch function, and then on the very edge of the dial plate, it was signed Paddock with its number. And here you see the box and the certificate. So, fast forward, we sold the watch in 1999 with an estimate of $3 to $5 million, and $11 million it was sold. I actually had to deliver that news as well to Pete Fullerton, and again, he said he didn't regret it. What else was he going to say? But I kind of think he meant it. Fullerton passed away. Oh, then we sold the watch again. on top, you see, in 2014. And what was a world record for 15 years as the most important, expensive watch or timepiece of any kind ever sold, did it again in 2014. So, we move on to George Daniels, but we will come back to Pete Fullerton in a few minutes. I think we're going to come back to Pete Fullerton. Well, I think I'm talking about Pete Fullerton here. Sorry. Fullerton passed away in 2012, and following his death, his lawyer summoned me to his home to pick up the watches. In fact, John Redfern was with me. The collection was a tight group of approximately 61 pieces and included Graves' yellow gold tonneau minute repeating wristwatch with his arms engraved on the back. And that was part of a twin. The platinum one had been sold years earlier at another Swiss auction house. That shall go unnamed. In addition to the watches, though, the best part was that we were given a box of Pete's documents. The box contained family photographs, numerous photographs of Henry Graves on horseback, all over the place, and correspondence regarding the super complication, including copies of correspondence announcing its delivery in 1933 and the precautions they had taken to make sure that the watch was unharmed. Well, it got delivered to Graves finally in 1933 in January, and apparently sometime in the next 2 years, I guess he didn't follow the instructions, and the watch had a little bit of a mishap, I guess you would say. So it went back to Paddock Museum, and when it came back with another letter, but this one had quite a strident tone, admonishing for not handling the watch carefully. So, the watch went back to Henry Graves, and with that we received, when Pete died, this incredible box of documents. So, while I was excited, and this included letters from from Pete to Seth Atwood. So while it was exciting, what was I going to do with them? We'd already sold the Graves in 1999. So there was a lot of schadenfreude going on there. But never fear, we got that second chance. And in 2014, we were able to use a good amount of those documents, which were really fascinating. I think one included Graves' approval of the drawing design. So, as I said, further details, and then the auction. And I have to say, at first you're thinking when you have to sell something a second time, what on earth are you going to say about it that you haven't already said? I mean, it's the most complicated watch in the world. It's got 24 complications. But to be able to add the historical standpoint, well, that was just an amazing thing to have the privilege to do. The benefit of staying in Sotheby's, you see, over so many years is that there are times when you do get to sell the same object twice. And this is the best example of that. So it broke a record again for the most expensive watch in the world, most expensive timepiece. That record didn't last as long because at a charity auction, notice my verbiage, another watch by Paddock, a master chime, sold for, I think, John can correct me, 30 million?
39.
39, right. Yeah, that was really exciting. So, let's keep on. Now we get to George Daniels. So, in 2006, Andrew Crisford and Sebastian Whitestone of Bob and A, along with Sotheby's, held a retrospective of George Daniels watches in honor of his 80th birthday. They succeeded in getting all but one watch, which was Space Traveler 1, to be shown at the retrospective. It was the first time all of George's watches were displayed together under one roof. To say that it was magical would be the understatement of the century. And George was quite pleased, and his star, which was already bright, shone even brighter than ever. In fact, at that point, having made 23 pocket watches, the only way you could own a Daniels pocket watch was by acquisition at auction. When the rare event occurred, it sold for more than the last. Therefore, by the time George Daniels passed away in 2011, we knew his watches would be met with great expectation. In 2012, we were honored to sell the George Daniels Horological Collection. And you see there, that was the front of the catalog, and that is the back cover, showing some of his amazing watches, including Space Traveler 2, which is nestled up on the upper left. So, I lost my spot. So the sale in 2012 included 137 lots, 4 of his pocket watches, and 5 of his wristwatches, such as Space Traveler 2. When it was sold, it brought the highest price of any English watch at the time, of 1.3 million pounds. The sale was a great success, lots of excitement. The room was packed, which is always wonderful. The exhibition was exciting. I almost didn't get there due to that hurricane, Sandy, but I made it. At the end of the day, his collection, which also included busts of him done by the artist Pestalozzi, and lots of interesting ephemera, sold for $13 million. Now, the Space Traveler watches, you know how I said it's always good to be at some place for a really long time? Well, Space Traveler 1 we had sold in 1988, and I will never forget that because that was the first Daniels that ever came to auction. And George was actually quite furious that the person he sold it to had decided to sell it and put it at auction. I mean, George had no idea how well the watch would do. But in 1988, at the sale, it did quite well. It brought something in the neighborhood of $200,000. And he was very happy. And he took a lovely picture outside of the hotel under the advertisement of Space Traveler 1. Now, Space Traveler 1 was hidden away since 1988 until 2019, when it was part of a collection called Masterworks of Time, which consisted of 800 pieces that we sold over 4 years. At the time that we sold Space Traveler 1 in 2019, the world was yet to be enveloped in the pandemic, and it was a very exciting sale, and we sold it for $4.7 million. Now, what was interesting about that, aside from being a world record and for being a world record for a modern watch by an independent and for George Daniels, what was also interesting was in 2017, 2 years earlier, we had resold Space Traveler 2, which actually was George's personal watch. And if you knew him, he would always walk around with two watches. And one inevitably would be Space Traveler 2, and another would be one of his other watches. So in 2017, we sold the watch for $4.1 million. So we were really we thought, it's an aberration, never gonna happen again. And it's now been loaned to the Science Museum, where the collection of a worshipful company of watchmakers is installed. And I think it's displayed beneath a portrait of George. So, moving on, I sort of jump back and forth because the real part of my story is the connection to Seth Appel. George Daniels didn't make a watch for just anyone. In fact, he chose the people he made the watches for. They didn't choose him. And Seth came to him. They had known each other at that point for nearly 10 years. And he said he wanted him to make him a watch that would include a contribution to horology. In fact, he wanted George to create something that hadn't been done in 215 years of horology. He wanted him to create a new escapement. Yeah, it's not going.
Use the arrow key on the
computer?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's the Space Traveler 1 that never appeared at the auction, at the retrospective. And here is the watch made for Seth Appel. So this was a commission watch. It's the only commission watch he ever did. So this is the beginning of the Coaxial Escapement. The idea behind it was to invent an escapement that would be more accurate than what the Swiss were going through at the time, which was the Swiss quartz crisis. It is a frictionless escapement and requires less oil, which is why it is supposed to be more accurate. He had pretty much of a hard time selling the watch to the Swiss. He was met time and again being turned down by Paddock, by Rawlings, I think even Longines, but I'm not sure about that. But eventually, in the 1990s, Omega decided this was an interesting technology and something that they should look into. By 1999, they were already in production with the first of their coaxial escapements that were placed in the majority, that would be placed in the majority of their watches. And again, it says, made for Seth Appel. So that is really a very important chapter to the state of horology today. So, ricocheting back a couple of centuries, I bring you to this interesting watch. It was a Breguet tourbillon, however, for King George III, and it was not signed Breguet on the dial. Well, you wonder why. It wasn't really signed Breguet on the movement, except you could see a little signature below that balance wheel. In fact, it was signed Recordon, who was Breguet's agent in Paris. In London. Why was it? Well, the year the watch was bought, in 1808, they were in the thick of the Napoleonic Wars. So how would it look for the King of England to be buying such a top piece of technology? Therefore, I guess it was a little bit of a cloak and dagger situation, because I figured the customs would never look at inside the watch, and apparently they didn't. And it remained in England, and still remains in England, because after we sold it, they were unable to get an export license because they considered it a national treasure, and I can understand that. But it was a magnificent watch, and it had been bought by this interesting collector who we only met really once or twice, and that was in November of 1999 when he bought this watch at Sotheby's in London, and then not even a month later when he bought our Ferrero Rocher Singing Bird watch in the first of the big time museum sales in December of 1999. And then we never saw him again. We always tried to contact him, but we didn't. Eventually he did pass away, and he's quite well connected in the country he lives in, and his family are quite philanthropic. And of course they came across the desk of our office in that country. And the meeting for me was arranged to meet with the mother and the daughter. Now, I knew that he had bought these two watches. That was it. I didn't know what else he had. But for me, the idea was just to get those two watches. So to my lunch meeting with them, I brought the catalog, the two catalogs that showed the two watches. To my absolute surprise, they said, "Oh, we've never seen them." To which I said, "Well, did he ever sell anything?" "Oh, no, he never sold anything." To which I said, "Here are the catalogs, here are the pictures. I think you need to go home and find them." And off they went. And about a year later, they came back and they were ready to sell. And he had a truckload of things that he took from his vault, that they took from his vaults. And the reason I tell the story is because, you know, we're dealing with collectors, and a lot of times they don't really want to tell all the ins and outs of what they've collected, and they don't make lists, and suddenly, you know, time is up, and their survivors are left with a ton of property, and they don't know what it is, and they've never seen it, and what are they going to do? That was one of those stories. So it's sort of a cautionary tale to make sure your significant other knows what you've got in the vault. By the way, the watch originally in 1999 sold for just under $1 million. And in 2020, when we sold it as part of a single owner collection of his pieces, we sold it for $2 million. So hence, there's the importance. Know what they're collecting. And I will finish up tonight with this last one, more lighthearted, I suppose. Andy Warhol, I'm sure you all recognize him. And I was, you know, when I was 10, I was working on the Andy Warhol sale. But I was not old enough to know King Farouk, okay? I just want to get that out there. So, the Andy Warhol sale was yet another very interesting chapter in my career at Sotheby's. I had met Andy Warhol once. I had to walk him down to property pickup, which he knew he was in for an interesting experience, so we sort of laughed about that. I was there to try to clear the way. And I think for once they recognized the person and they got his things for him. But Andy Warhol was the kind of person that if you lived in New York and you went out and about, you saw him in all the flea markets on Saturday and Sunday. In fact, Andy was one of the original wristwatch collectors. That said, he hadn't really refined his wristwatch taste. There were some very important pieces, but on the whole, it was kind of a mixed bag. In any event, we were the first department, along with our jewelry department, to go into the townhouse in the Upper East Side. You could not walk in that house. He was one of those people that liked to have a possession. And in fact, there were some things that were never unpacked. So what would he do with all of that? In the end, we had 6 catalogs, which covered Art Deco, Americana, American paintings, American Indian art, contemporary paintings, and watches and jewelry. The auction was a 9-day marathon. But as the day grew closer to the start, even of the exhibitions, the excitement was building around the auction world. And it was evident that this would become an event not to be missed. Clients lined around the block with time-stamped tickets to enter the exhibition. Now, my office happened to be on the north side of the building, which provided a bird's eye view of the line, and we were able to see some celebrities. None too exciting. However, when the day of the auction came, at least the first one, there were all sorts of Andy Warhol people there. And that included 2 of his superstars, people that he used in his movies. One was baby Jane Hulser, and the other, Ultraviolet, who you couldn't miss with her shocking purple hair. We didn't see much shocking purple hair at Sotheby's in those days. So, one of the highlights for me, actually, before I move on to one other, was that I got to bid on the phone with Bianca Jagger. She was terribly nice. So we thought we were done with Andy Warhol 9 days later into this auction, which went extraordinarily well. In fact, you're wondering why I have this picture of Gumby up there, but I'll get to him in a second. So they found another tranche of watches and jewelry. And where was this tranche? Hidden in the canopy of a 4-poster bed. It was only when they dismantled the 4-poster bed did they find the collection of jewelry and watches. And that became the last Andy Warhol sale in December of 1988. So back to old Gumby up there. So in the collection, this really boggled my mind, were 3 quartz watches. One was Fred Flintstone of the Flintstones, another was Judy Jetson of the Jetsons, and then Gumby. And honestly, a couple of weeks before the auction, I was at Bloomingdale's, where he must have bought them because he still had the price tags, and they were still sealed in their boxes. And they were being sold for $26. Our combined auction estimate, actually really we were generous. We said $60 to $80. I mean, who on earth is going to want this Gumby watch? So the Gumby watch, is much to our surprise, actually sold for $2,400. Well, interestingly enough, I recently discovered that he had given a Gumby watch to Keith Haring, and he had framed it, and he signed it. And up there, on the upper right, you can sort of make out his unmistakable signature. So now I have to think, maybe they were buying them because they were going to forge a signature, or maybe they were going to get one too, and you never got them. In any event, that's my story of Gumby. And I have to say that is the end of my lecture, and I thank you very, very much for